The day they read my grandfather's will, my Aunt Rebecca laughed. Not a nervous laugh, not the kind that slips out when grief makes you uncomfortable. It was a real laugh, short, dismissive. The kind you give when a server brings you the wrong dish and you are about to send it back. She looked at Grandma Dorothy sitting in the corner of that conference room in her good blue cardigan, the one she saved for church and doctor's appointments, and Rebecca actually laughed. And nobody said a word. I sat there, holding a paper cup of water that had gone warm, watching my grandmother fold her hands in her lap the way she always did, quietly, carefully, and I thought, she knows. She already knows what is about to happen in this room. And she came anyway. What I did not know, what none of us knew yet, was that Dorothy May Calloway had not come to that conference room to receive anything. She had come to watch. Let me tell you who my grandmother was, before I tell you what they did to her. Because if you do not understand who she was, none of what comes after will hit the way it should. Dorothy Calloway grew up in Macon, Georgia. Youngest of 7 children. Father worked the rail yard. Mother cleaned houses on the north side of town. Dorothy told me once, just once, and she said it the way people say things they have carried for decades. She told me that her mother came home every Friday smelling like other people's laundry detergent, and that for a long time, that smell meant safety to her. Meant her mother had made it through another week. She married my grandfather, Harold Calloway, in 1971. They moved to Cincinnati, Ohio. Harold drove a truck for a furniture company for 31 years. Dorothy worked the front desk at a pediatric clinic until her knees gave out. They were not wealthy people. But they were not struggling people either. They were the kind of people who knew exactly what a dollar was worth, because they had watched it disappear too many times to be careless with it. They bought a house on Fenwick Street in 1978. 3 bedrooms. A backyard with a pear tree that Dorothy loved unreasonably. She made preserves every September. She gave them away in labeled mason jars. She showed up to things early and left late, and always brought food. She was the kind of woman who remembered your birthday and forgot her own. And Harold, my grandfather. Harold loved her the way some men love, quietly, without announcement, in the form of small, daily acts that only become visible once they are gone. He shoveled her side of the driveway first. He kept her side of the car warm in winter. When she got her first hearing aid at 74, he learned to speak more clearly without her ever having to ask. He died on a Tuesday morning in March. Pancreatic cancer. 14 weeks from diagnosis to gone. Dorothy did not fall apart. That is the thing about women who have been strong their whole lives. When the worst thing happens, they go very still, very quiet, like all that strength turns inward and holds them together from the inside. But here is what nobody tells you about strength. It makes you look like you do not need anything. And when you look like you do not need anything, people stop offering. My grandfather left behind a modest estate, or so we thought. The house on Fenwick Street. A savings account. A small investment portfolio that Harold had quietly tended for decades. The number, once the attorney pulled everything together, came to approximately $2.3 million. None of us knew, not even my mother. Harold Calloway had driven that truck, and Dorothy had worked that front desk, and together, slowly, carefully, they had built something real. He had never talked about it, because he was not the kind of man who talked about money. And now here it was, sitting in a conference room at the law offices of Whitmore and Associates on Montgomery Road, waiting to be distributed, and my Aunt Rebecca, Harold's daughter from his first marriage, had already decided exactly how that distribution was going to go. I need to explain Rebecca to you, because she is not a monster. That is what made her so effective. Rebecca Calloway Marsh was 61 years old. She lived in a large house in Hyde Park with her husband Gary, who had done well in commercial real estate. She wore her hair in a precise blonde bob. She drove a silver Lexus. She said things like, "We need to be practical, and at the end of the day, and I am just being realistic." She had the particular confidence of a person who has never had to seriously reconsider their own opinion. She had not been close with Harold when he was alive. Not estranged, just distant. She called on birthdays. She came to Christmas some years. She sent a fruit basket when Harold was diagnosed, which Dorothy had quietly donated to the hospital floor. But the moment Harold died, Rebecca appeared. She was at the house on Fenwick Street the day after the funeral with a legal pad and a tape measure. She said she was just helping to get organized. She walked through the rooms, making small notes. She asked Dorothy which pieces of furniture had sentimental value and which ones were just things. Dorothy told her she did not need to worry about any of that yet. Rebecca smiled the kind of smile that does not reach the eyes and said, "Of course. Of course." Then the meeting started. She began calling my mother, Harold's stepdaughter, Dorothy's daughter, with updates. "Just keeping everyone informed," she said. She had spoken to the attorney. She was liaising. She used that word, liaising, like she had been appointed to something. She started referring to Dorothy as Dad's wife. Not his widow. Not Dorothy. Dad's wife. Like 53 years of marriage was a technicality. And here's the thing that makes me angry even now. Sitting here telling you this, nobody corrected her. Not at first. Because she said it so casually. So matter-of-factly. And when people say wrong things with enough confidence, there is this moment, just a moment, where everyone in the room wonders if maybe they are the one who is confused. That is the first tool in that particular playbook. Make the wrongness sound like common sense. I was living in Columbus at the time, working as a hospital administrator. I drove to Cincinnati most weekends after Harold died to check on Dorothy. She seemed okay. That word, okay, I used it too easily and for too long. She was quiet, yes. She had stopped making her preserves. She left the TV on at night, which she had never done before. But I told myself those were normal grief responses. I told myself she was adjusting. What I did not see, what I was not looking for, were the small erosions happening around her. Rebecca had begun copying herself on communications with the estate attorney. She framed it as making sure everyone is on the same page. She started stopping by the house when I was not there, bringing Gary sometimes, walking through rooms. She told Dorothy she was just worried about her living alone in such a big house. She said the house might be too much to maintain. She mentioned, gently, that it might make sense to explore options. Options. That word. Dorothy was 79 years old, fully lucid, in reasonable health for her age, and living in the home she had occupied for 46 years. But in Rebecca's framing, she had somehow become a problem to be managed, a liability, a variable in an equation that needed to be simplified. And Dorothy, my grandmother, the woman who had folded her hands in her lap and said nothing for decades rather than make anyone uncomfortable, Dorothy said nothing. I should have paid more attention to that silence. The attorney's name was Gerald Whitmore. He was a small man in his late 60s with a careful handshake and reading glasses he wore on a chain. He had handled Harold's affairs for 20 years. He knew exactly what Harold had wanted. But Rebecca got to him first. I do not mean that in a criminal sense. Not yet. I mean she simply made herself the most present, the most organized, the most apparently reasonable person in the room. She brought documents to meetings. She asked informed questions. She was, by every surface measure, the responsible one. And in the absence of anyone else stepping up, Gerald Whitmore began gravitating toward her, the way people naturally gravitate toward whoever seems most certain. My mother was grieving. She was 62 years old, and she had just lost her stepfather, who had been in her life for 40 years, and she did not have the bandwidth to fight for position in a legal process she did not fully understand. I was 2 hours away, and working 60-hour weeks, and I kept thinking, it will be fine. Harold had a will. There was a process. The process would protect Dorothy. Look, I know how that sounds now. I know. If you have ever watched someone you love get quietly pushed aside by people who were supposed to be family, you already know where this feeling goes. Stay with me. The will reading was scheduled for a Thursday in April, 6 weeks after Harold's funeral. Rebecca called me the night before. She said she wanted to prepare me. She said the will was a little complicated, and that she hoped everyone would approach it with maturity. She said she was worried about Dorothy getting her hopes up. Getting her hopes up. About her own husband's estate. I did not sleep that night. I lay in my hotel room near the Montgomery Road exit and listened to the highway noise and the hum of the mini refrigerator, and I turned that phrase over and over. Getting her hopes up. What did Rebecca know that I did not? What had she done in those 6 weeks while I had been telling myself everything was fine? I arrived at Whitmore & Associates at 8:45 for a 9 o'clock meeting. Dorothy was already there. She was sitting in the corner of the conference room, in her blue cardigan. She had her small purse in her lap. Her hands were folded on top of it. She looked at me when I came in, and she smiled. Not a sad smile, not a worried smile. Just a smile. Like she was genuinely glad to see me. Rebecca arrived at 8:50 with Gary and her son Trevor, who was 29, and worked in finance and had the particular expression of someone who has been told that being in this room is a formality. And that is when I understood something that I had been too optimistic or too cowardly to understand before. This had already been decided in Rebecca's mind. She had spent 6 weeks constructing a reality in which Dorothy was a footnote, a dependent, a sympathetic but ultimately secondary figure in Harold Calloway's story. And she had been so careful and so consistent about it that she had almost convinced everyone else, including Gerald Whitmore, that this was simply the reasonable way to see things. Almost. Gerald Whitmore cleared his throat and opened the folder on the table in front of him. The room smelled like recycled office air and the ghost of someone's coffee from the morning. The fluorescent light above the table had a slight flicker that nobody mentioned. Rebecca uncapped her pen. Trevor had his phone face down on the table in a way that somehow communicated he expected this to go quickly. Dorothy sat in her corner and looked at nothing in particular. And Gerald Whitmore began to read. The first 3 items in the will were unremarkable. Harold's tools went to his neighbor Frank Delaney, who had borrowed them for 30 years anyway. A coin collection went to a veterans organization in Dayton. His watch, the Seiko he had worn every day since 1987, went to my mother. Rebecca's pen moved across her legal pad. I watched her check things off. She had known all of this. She had seen the will. Then Gerald Whitmore paused. He turned to the next page. And something in his posture shifted. Just slightly. Just enough. The way a person shifts when they are about to say something that changes the temperature of the room. He looked up. He looked directly at Dorothy in her corner chair. And Rebecca laughed. Be honest with me. What would you have done in that room? Would you have said something? Would you have stayed quiet? I genuinely want to know. Drop it in the comments below. That laugh, that one small dismissive sound. It is the thing I will never forget about that morning. Because it told me everything about what Rebecca had planned, and everything about how wrong she was about to be. But the full story of what Gerald Whitmore read from that page, and what Dorothy had quietly, methodically been doing for the past 6 weeks, that is what you need to hear next. And it starts with a phone call Dorothy made the morning after Harold's funeral. A phone call to a different attorney. One that Rebecca did not know about. Here is what I found out later. And I want you to hold on to every single word of this. The morning after Harold Calloway's funeral, while the rest of us were still figuring out how to breathe without him in the world, Dorothy Mae Calloway woke up at 6:15, made herself a cup of coffee, sat down at the kitchen table on Fenwick Street, and made a phone call. She did not call family. She did not call her pastor, though Pastor Williams had left 3 messages. She did not call the grief counselor the hospital had recommended. She called a woman named Catherine Osei, an estate attorney whose name Dorothy had written on the back of a recipe card 2 years earlier. Dorothy had heard Catherine speak at a community event at the Cincinnati Public Library, a free legal clinic for seniors. Dorothy had kept that recipe card in the drawer beneath the telephone for 2 years. She had never told Harold she kept it. She had never told anyone. Now, I need you to understand something about my grandmother. Dorothy Calloway was not a suspicious person. She was not strategic, not in the way people mean when they use that word like a compliment. But she was observant. She had spent 53 years watching the way people moved around money, watching how it changed the temperature in a room, how it rearranged loyalties, how it made people say things in a gentle voice that they absolutely meant in a hard one. She had watched Rebecca for years. She had watched the way Rebecca spoke about Harold's first wife's furniture like it still had a prior claim. She had watched the way Rebecca used the word fair, that specific, elastic version of fair that really means favorable to me. And when Harold got sick, when the diagnosis came in January and the word pancreatic landed in that exam room like a stone dropped in still water, Dorothy had made a quiet decision. She was going to be prepared, not vindictive, not scheming, prepared, the way a woman who grew up watching her mother come home smelling like someone else's laundry detergent learns to be prepared. The way a woman who has spent her whole life making things easy for other people finally decides, at 79 years old, to make things easy for herself. Catherine O'Shea met with Dorothy 4 times over the course of Harold's illness. They went through everything. Every account, every document, every piece of paper Harold had ever signed. Dorothy came to each meeting with a manila folder and a yellow legal pad and a pen. She asked questions. She took notes in her small, careful handwriting. She did not rush. She did not panic. She just worked. And what Catherine O'Shea discovered in those 4 meetings would completely reframe everything that happened in Gerald Whitmore's conference room. Because Harold Calloway, it turned out, had not left everything in one will. He had left something else. Something older. Something that Gerald Whitmore either did not know about or had chosen not to mention. And Rebecca, with all her legal pads and her careful positioning and her 6 weeks of liaising, had not found it either. Nobody had found it. Because Dorothy had not shown anyone where to look. Let me bring you back into that conference room on Montgomery Road. The fluorescent light with the flicker, the paper cup of warm water in my hand. Dorothy in her corner, Rebecca uncapping her pen. Gerald Whitmore read the first document, the primary will, the one Rebecca had already reviewed, and his voice was the flat, professional kind that tells you nothing about what he actually thinks. He moved through Harold's standard bequests. Frank Delaney got the tools. The Veterans Organization got the coins. My mother got the Seiko watch. Then he got to the main distribution clause. And this is where Rebecca sat up straighter. This is where Trevor put his phone in his jacket pocket. This is where Gary from commercial real estate leaned forward with both forearms on the table. The primary will, the one Gerald held in his hand, split the estate 3 ways. 1/3 to Rebecca as Harold's biological daughter. 1/3 to a trust for Harold's grandchildren, including Trevor, and 1/3 to Dorothy as Harold's surviving spouse. 1/3 of the home she had lived in for 46 years. Of the savings account she had contributed to for 5 decades. Of the investment portfolio her husband had built in part with money from her salary at the pediatric clinic. 1/3. Rebecca let out a small breath of relief, not even trying to conceal it, and she laughed, that short, dismissive sound, and said something to Gary in a voice just low enough that it was meant to be heard, but not quite answered. Something about generous and more than reasonable. I looked at Dorothy. She had not moved. Her hands were folded on her purse. Her face was entirely still. And I understood then, really understood, in my whole body, the way understanding sometimes arrives as a physical sensation, that my grandmother was not sitting in that corner because she had accepted what was happening. She was sitting in that corner because she was waiting. Gerald Whitmore cleared his throat again. He turned to the second page, and he said, and I remember this precisely because I have replayed it in my mind probably 400 times, he said, "There is a second instrument to be entered into the record." Rebecca looked up from her legal pad. Gerald continued. He said that he had received, 3 days prior, a certified copy of a document executed in Harold Calloway's own hand, witnessed and notarized, dated approximately 14 months earlier. He said the document had been delivered to his office by a colleague named Catherine O'Shea, along with a formal legal letter asserting its validity and precedence over certain provisions of the primary will. Rebecca said, "What?" Just that one word, in a voice I had never heard from her before, smaller than her usual voice, like the air had gone out of something. Gerald Whitmore looked directly at Dorothy in her corner chair and said, "Mrs. Calloway, your husband prepared a supplemental testamentary document approximately 14 months ago, during a period of cognitive clarity well documented by his attending physician. In that document, he amended his primary distribution to assign the entirety of the marital estate, the home on Fenwick Street, the joint savings account, and the investment portfolio, solely and exclusively to you." The room went so quiet, I could hear the flickering light above the table. Dorothy unfolded her hands. She placed them flat on the table in front of her. And she said, in that same calm, clear voice she had used at church, and at doctor's appointments, and at every moment in her life when something mattered, "I know. If you are still with me right now, if your jaw just did what I think it did, this is exactly why these stories need to be told. Subscribe if you want to hear the rest. I promise you, we are not finished." Now I want to tell you what Harold actually did, because this is not just Dorothy's story. This is also the story of a quiet man who understood his family more clearly than his family understood themselves. 14 months before he died, Harold Calloway drove himself to Catherine O'Sea's office on Reading Road in Avondale. He did not tell Dorothy he was going. He did not tell anyone. He drove there on a Tuesday afternoon in January, in the early days after his diagnosis, before the illness had taken much from him physically. He was still clear. He was still Harold. He sat down with Catherine, and he told her 3 things. First, he told her that Dorothy had built everything alongside him, dollar by dollar, year by year, and that it was not his money to distribute to people who had not earned it. He said that specifically. People who have not earned it. Catherine told me later that he said it without anger. He said it the way you state a fact that requires no argument. Second, he told her he was not changing his will in a way that would cause a legal fight while he was still alive. He did not want Dorothy managing a family conflict on top of watching him die. He wanted to protect her from that. So the amendment would only be activated after his death. Executed quietly, delivered to Gerald Whitmore's office by Catherine herself at the appropriate moment. Third, he told her he was going to tell Dorothy. Not the details, not the legal language. Just enough. He was going to tell her that she was taken care of, that she did not need to be afraid. He drove home, made dinner, he still cooked on Tuesdays, and after they had eaten, he told Dorothy, "Whatever happens, you will be fine. The house is yours. Everything we built is yours." Dorothy told me later that she had cried. That she had sat at that kitchen table on Fenwick Street and cried in a way she had not allowed herself to cry in a very long time. And then she had gotten up, washed her face, and called Catherine O'Sea the next morning to begin understanding exactly what that promise looked like on paper. That is why she kept that recipe card. That is why she went to those 4 meetings with her manila folder and her yellow legal pad. She was not building a case against Rebecca. She was learning to be the custodian of something her husband had trusted her to protect. Look, I want to stop here for a moment and acknowledge something. Because I have thought about this a lot. Harold Calloway did not do everything right. He did not have a fully honest conversation with Rebecca. He did not explain his thinking to his family while he was alive, and could have weathered the discomfort. He chose peace for himself and complexity for everyone who came after. That is a real flaw in an otherwise decent man, and I do not want to make him a saint just because Rebecca made him look like one by comparison. But he knew his daughter. He knew what she would do with information she received in advance. He had watched her operate for 60 years. And he made a calculated decision. Imperfect, human, flawed, to protect the woman who had spent 53 years making his life work, without ever once asking him to notice. I think about that Tuesday dinner often. I think about Harold cooking, and Dorothy eating, and neither of them saying very much, and then that one conversation, and then Dorothy at the sink afterward with the water running, crying quietly. I think Harold Calloway knew exactly what he was doing. Rebecca did not accept it. Of course she did not. Within 4 days of the reading at Gerald Whitmore's office, Rebecca had retained an attorney, a man named Douglas Pell, who worked out of a glass office building in Blue Ash, and whose particular specialty was contesting estates. She filed a formal objection in the Hamilton County Probate Court. The grounds, as her attorney articulated them, were threefold. 1. She questioned Harold's cognitive capacity at the time he executed the supplemental document, despite the physician's documentation Gerald Whitmore had entered into the record. 2. She alleged undue influence, specifically, that Dorothy, or someone acting on Dorothy's behalf, had manipulated Harold during his illness into altering his testamentary wishes. 3. She argued that the supplemental document conflicted with the primary will in ways that required judicial resolution. It was, Catherine O'Sea told me when she called to give me the summary, a very standard playbook. Challenge the mental capacity. Allege manipulation. Create procedural delay. The goal was not necessarily to win outright. The goal was to make the process so expensive, so exhausting, so prolonged, that Dorothy would agree to a settlement just to make it stop. Rebecca knew Dorothy was 79 years old. She was making a calculation. She was making a calculation about how much fight my grandmother had left in her. And this is the part that I find genuinely difficult to talk about without my voice doing something I do not want it to do. This is the part where I realized that Rebecca had never actually known Dorothy at all. She had seen the blue cardigan. She had seen the folded hands and the quiet voice and the mason jars of pear preserves. She had seen a woman who did not make scenes and did not make demands and did not raise her voice in a conference room. She had read that as softness. What she had actually been looking at, for 61 years, was patience. Those are two entirely different things. Catherine O'Shea filed her response to the objection within 10 days. She had been ready. She had physician records. She had the notarized documentation. She had 2 witnesses from Catherine's own office who had been present at the execution of the supplemental instrument. She had, critically, a recording. Harold Calloway, at Catherine's professional suggestion, had consented to an audio recording of the session at which he executed the supplemental document. 14 months ago, sitting in that office on Reading Road, Harold had spoken into a recorder for approximately 22 minutes. He had stated his name. He had stated the date. He had stated his diagnosis and his prognosis, as he understood it. He had stated, in plain, clear, deliberate language, exactly why he was making the changes he was making, and what he wanted to happen to the estate he had built. He had named Rebecca specifically. He had not been unkind. He had not been angry. He had simply been honest in the way that men who know they are dying sometimes finally allow themselves to be. He said he loved his daughter. He said he believed she was financially secure and would continue to be financially secure without his estate. He said Dorothy had no such security of her own and had declined to build one because she had trusted him to provide it. He said he was honoring that trust. He said, "This is not a punishment. This is a correction." Have you ever watched someone protect the person they loved from beyond the reach of their own life? Because that is what I heard on that recording. Share this if you know someone who needs to hear that kind of love still exists. Douglas Pell, Rebecca's attorney, listened to that recording at a preliminary hearing in June. What happened after that hearing, what Rebecca did next, and what Dorothy said to me in the parking garage of the courthouse afterward, and what the judge ultimately said from the bench, that is the part that changed the way I think about strength. That is the part where the whole story turns. The preliminary hearing in Hamilton County Probate Court was scheduled for a Wednesday morning in early June. Courtroom 3, on the 2nd floor. The kind of room that smells like old carpet and copy paper, where the overhead lights are too bright and there is never enough air. I sat in the gallery behind Dorothy and Catherine O'Shea. My mother was next to me. She had driven from Dayton, and she had not slept, and she kept turning her rings around on her fingers, a thing she did when she was trying to hold herself still. Rebecca was at the opposing table with Douglas Pell. Gary was in the gallery behind her. Trevor was not there. I noticed that. I do not know what it means. I just noticed it. The judge was a woman named the Honorable Miriam Langford. She was somewhere in her late 50s. Silver hair cut short. Reading glasses on a chain, the same style as Gerald Whitmore's, which I found briefly absurd to notice. She had the particular stillness of someone who has spent 30 years hearing people argue about money, and has long since stopped being surprised by how low it makes them go. Douglas Pell made his opening arguments with the confident precision of a man who had made similar arguments many times before. He spoke about Harold's deteriorating health. He used phrases like diminished capacity and susceptibility to influence and irregularities in the execution timeline. He was polished. He was organized. He had clearly done this before. And then Catherine O'Shea stood up. She is a small woman. Not small in the way that makes people underestimate her. Or rather, people do underestimate her. But only once. She placed 3 items on the table in front of her. The notarized supplemental document. The attending physician's letter, which detailed Harold's cognitive status at the time of execution in language so precise and so thorough that it left no honest interpretation open. And a USB drive. She looked at Judge Langford, and she said, "Your Honor, with the court's permission, I would like to play approximately 4 minutes of a 22-minute audio recording made during the execution of this document, in which the decedent, Harold James Calloway, speaks to the specific concerns that opposing counsel has raised today." Judge Langford said, "Proceed." They played Harold's voice in that courtroom. I want you to sit with that for a moment. My grandfather's voice, low and measured, and a little bit slow, the way it always was, the way it had always been. Nothing changed by illness or by the knowledge of what was coming. His voice filled that room from a small speaker on Catherine O'Sea's table. He said his name. He said the date. He said, "I am of sound mind, and I understand what I am doing here today, and why I am doing it." He paused. Then he said, "My daughter Rebecca is a capable woman. She has a good life and a secure life, and she has built that herself. And I am proud of her for it. What I have built belongs to Dorothy. It belongs to Dorothy, because Dorothy is the reason any of it exists. I would not have had the steadiness to save the way I saved if she had not been next to me every single morning making the steadiness possible. This is not a complicated thing. This is just the truth." Douglas Pell did not move during the recording. Rebecca kept her eyes on the table in front of her, and Dorothy, sitting 2 feet in front of me, reached into her purse and took out a folded tissue. She did not use it right away. She just held it. The way you hold something when you know you might need it, and you are trying to hold yourself together until that moment comes. Douglas Pell asked to approach the bench. He and Catherine stood before Judge Langford for approximately 4 minutes. I could not hear what was said. I watched Pell's posture. I watched the way his shoulders shifted. That is how you know how a conversation is going, not from the words, but from what the body does. His shoulders shifted twice. He returned to his table. He leaned toward Rebecca and spoke in her ear. I watched her face. She shook her head once, sharply. He leaned in again. She shook her head again. She was not done. And this is the part I keep coming back to, even now, because what Rebecca did next was not strategic. It was not calculated. It was something much more raw and much more human than strategy. She asked to address the court directly. Douglas Pell put his hand on her arm. She moved her arm away. She stood up, and she said, "And I am going to tell you what she said as precisely as I can, because I think it matters. I think it is the key to understanding everything about what went wrong in that family." She said, "Your Honor, with respect, I think my father was confused. I think he made decisions at the end of his life that he would not have made if he had been thinking clearly about fairness. I just want what is fair. I just want what he would have wanted if he had been himself." The courtroom was very quiet. Judge Langford looked at her over the top of her reading glasses for a long moment, long enough to be uncomfortable, long enough that Gary shifted in the gallery behind her. Then Judge Langford said, "Mrs. Marsh, this court has just heard your father, in his own words, recorded 14 months before his death, describe precisely what he wanted and why he wanted it. He mentioned fairness specifically. He spoke to it at length. Are you telling this court that you understand your father's wishes better than your father did?" Rebecca sat down. She sat down and she did not say anything else, and Douglas Pell straightened the papers in front of him, in the particular way that attorneys straighten papers, when they already know how this ends. I genuinely want to know, and I mean this. Drop it in the comments. Would you have stood up the way Rebecca did? Or would you have taken the settlement? Because I have thought about that question for a long time. Judge Miriam Langford ruled from the bench that afternoon. She did not reserve her decision. She did not schedule a follow-up date. She ruled right there, in that room that smelled like old carpet and copy paper. While the 2 bright lights hummed overhead and my mother turned her rings around her fingers, and Dorothy sat with her tissue folded in her hand. The ruling was 41 minutes long. I am going to give you the parts that matter. She upheld the supplemental testamentary document in its entirety. She found that the evidence of Harold Calloway's cognitive capacity at the time of execution was thorough, credible, and uncontradicted by any medical evidence introduced by opposing counsel. She found that the allegation of undue influence had no factual basis in the record, and was, in her specific language, unsupported by anything beyond the petitioner's preferred interpretation of events. She found that the home on Fenwick Street belonged to Dorothy Calloway, that the joint savings account belonged to Dorothy Calloway, that the investment portfolio, all of it, the full balance as of the date of Harold's death, belonged to Dorothy Calloway. $2.3 million. To a woman in a blue cardigan with a folded tissue in her hand. And then, Judge Langford said one more thing before she closed the record. She looked, and I mean she physically looked. She directed her gaze at the section of the courtroom where Rebecca and Douglas Pell were seated. And she said, "This court has seen many contested estate proceedings. And in a substantial portion of them, the contest is motivated not by genuine legal concern, but by financial expectation. The record in this matter reflects a clear and documented expression of the decedent's wishes. This court's function is to honor those wishes, not to redistribute assets according to what surviving family members believe they deserve. This proceeding is closed. She picked up her folder. She stood. She left the room. I caught up with Dorothy in the parking garage on the second level of the courthouse building. She was walking slowly toward the car, and I fell into step beside her. And for a moment, neither of us said anything. The garage had that specific echo that parking garages have. Every footstep slightly louder than it should be. Every sound with a hollow twin attached to it. I said, "Grandma, how are you doing?" She stopped walking. She looked at me. And she said something that I have been thinking about ever since. Something I could not fully understand the first time I heard it. And I'm still not sure I fully understand now. She said, "I do not feel like I won anything, baby. I just feel like Harold kept his word." That was it. That was the whole of it for her. Not victory, not vindication, not the satisfaction of watching Rebecca walk out of that courtroom with nothing. Just, Harold kept his word. I stood in that parking garage on the second level of the Hamilton County Courthouse, and I thought about what it would mean to love someone so completely and so quietly for 53 years that the most important thing, the thing that landed with the most weight, more than $2.3 million, and a house on Fenwick Street, and a judge's ruling, was simply that he had meant what he said. I did not have words for it right then. I am not sure I have the right words even now. We walked to the car. I drove her home to Fenwick Street. The pear tree in the backyard was starting to come in. It was early June, just the beginning of things. Dorothy looked at it through the kitchen window when we got inside, and she said she thought this year she might make preserves again. Here is what happened in the weeks and months that followed, because I think you deserve the full picture, not just the courtroom moment. Rebecca filed a notice of appeal. Douglas Pell withdrew from the case 2 weeks later, citing what he described in his letter as irreconcilable differences in litigation strategy. She retained a second attorney, a younger woman from a firm in Kenwood. That attorney reviewed the record, met with Rebecca twice, and advised her strongly against pursuing the appeal. Rebecca did not pursue the appeal. We do not know exactly what was said in those 2 meetings. We do not need to know. The result speaks for itself. Dorothy stayed in the house on Fenwick Street. She had the kitchen repainted, a pale yellow that Harold had always liked, but they had never gotten around to. She had the pear tree properly pruned for the first time in years. She made 42 jars of preserves that September, labeled them in her small, careful handwriting, gave most of them away. Catherine Osei sent a bottle of wine. Dorothy sent her a jar of preserves in return, and a card that said, simply, "Thank you for doing what Harold asked." My mother and Rebecca have not spoken since the hearing. I do not know if they will. Family ruptures of this kind have a particular gravity to them. They pull things apart slowly, over time, and the shape of the gap changes, but the gap itself tends to remain. I wish I could tell you something more hopeful than that. I am trying to be honest with you. And that is the honest thing. As for me, I moved back to Cincinnati 8 months after the hearing. Took a position at a hospital network on the west side. Bought a house 12 minutes from Fenwick Street. I have Sunday dinner with Dorothy most weeks. Sometimes I stay too late, and she tells me to go home and get some sleep. And I tell her I will, and then I do not for another hour. I do not think I am entirely over the guilt. Not the guilt about what happened. I did not cause any of it. But the guilt of the distance. The guilt of telling myself it would be fine when I did not actually know that it would be fine. The guilt of watching my grandmother sit in a corner chair at a will reading and not standing up and saying, "Enough. Someone needs to say enough." She did not need me to say it. She had Harold's voice on a USB drive. She had Catherine Osei and a yellow legal pad and 40 years of watching how money moves through families and deciding, quietly, to be prepared. She did not need me. But I needed to be there. And I was not. And that is the part I carry. I want to end on something that I have not resolved, because I think the honest version of this story requires me to sit with the uncomfortable part, not just the satisfying part. Rebecca Calloway Marsh is not a cartoon. She is not a monster out of a fairy tale. She is a 61-year-old woman who watched her father build a life with another woman and die inside that life, and she believed, genuinely believed that she was owed something from that. She was wrong about what she was owed. She was wrong about how she went after it. She was wrong about Dorothy's strength and Harold's clarity and the law and the recording and nearly everything else. But the feeling underneath it all, that particular hunger, that sense that family should mean something when there is something to distribute, I do not think that feeling is purely monstrous. I think it is human and small and recognizable. And I think if most of us are honest, we can find some version of it somewhere in ourselves. That is not a defense of what she did. It is just the truth of what she is. And Harold who loved Dorothy so completely that he protected her from beyond his own life. Harold who drove to Catherine O'Sea's office on a Tuesday in January without telling anyone and spoke his truth into a recorder and then came home and made dinner. Harold was also a man who chose a private act of love over a hard public conversation, who left his daughter to discover in a courtroom what he could have told her at a kitchen table, who protected Dorothy's peace at the cost of Rebecca's, and even that framing is generous to him. Because what he really protected was his own peace, his own clean exit. The love was real. The love was also imperfect, in a very human way. Both things are true. What I keep coming back to, what I cannot fully resolve, is Dorothy in that conference room in April. Dorothy who knew. Dorothy who had sat across from Catherine O'Sea 4 times and understood exactly what was coming. Dorothy who could have walked into that room and said, I know what this document says, and I know what the other one says, and we can do this the easy way or the hard way. She did not say that. She sat in the corner in her blue cardigan, and she let Rebecca laugh. I used to think that was patience. I used to think that was the quality I had always admired in her, that long, still, unshakable patience. Now I think it might have been something else. Now I think she sat in that corner and let Rebecca laugh, because she needed Rebecca to hear her own laugh in that room. Needed her to make her calculation in front of witnesses. Needed the record to show, without any ambiguity, exactly who had laughed and why. I think Dorothy Calloway, in her blue cardigan, with her hands folded over her purse, was the most strategic person in that room. And nobody knew it. Not even me, until I had turned it over in my mind about 1,000 times. That is the version of the story that keeps me up at night. Not the one where the good person wins and the bad person loses, but the one where a 79-year-old woman decided, maybe consciously, maybe not, that the most powerful thing she could do in a room that was trying to erase her was to be still, to be absolutely, completely still, and let everyone else reveal themselves. Strength that looks like stillness. Patience that is also a trap. Love that is also a long, quiet war. Last September, I helped Dorothy label her preserves. 42 jars of pear, the same as always. She put them on the kitchen counter in 2 rows of 21, and she stood back and looked at them, with the same expression she had worn in that parking garage. Not triumph, not relief, just a kind of settled recognition. Like something had been restored to its correct position. She handed me a jar to take home. She said, "These are the best ones I have made in years. You need a good pear year to get the flavor right. It has to be a hard enough summer." I put the jar in my bag. I did not say anything for a moment. Then I said, "Grandma, how did you know it was going to work? In that conference room? How did you know?" She looked at me. And she said, and I want you to hear this the way I heard it. "In a kitchen that smelled like pear and sugar and September," she said, "baby. Harold told me. And Harold never lied to me once in 53 years. That is the only thing I needed to know." I drove home with a jar of preserves on the passenger seat and the windows down, and I thought about what it would feel like to trust another person that completely. To build a whole life on the specific weight of their word. I thought about Rebecca, wherever she was that evening. I thought about Harold, speaking into a recorder on a Tuesday in January, already knowing he was running out of Tuesdays. I thought about Dorothy, sitting in a corner chair, waiting. That is Dorothy's story. That is Harold's story. That is, in some uncomfortable way, Rebecca's story too, though she would not tell it the way I just did. These things happen inside families every single day, in probate courts and conference rooms and parking garages across this country. They happen quietly, mostly. Nobody writes about them. Nobody records them. And the people who get pushed into corners in blue cardigans do not always have a Catherine O'Sea with a USB drive. I share these stories because I think they matter. Because I think the specifics matter. The pear tree, the recipe card in the kitchen drawer, the Seiko watch, the way Harold cooked on Tuesdays. Because I think when we talk about family and money and what people do to each other, we owe it to everyone involved to tell the full human story. Not the clean version. The real one. If this story moved you, if it made you think about your own family, your own silences, your own corners, then share it with someone. Not because I need the numbers, but because some stories are meant to travel. Some stories need to find the person who needs them. And if you are new here, if this is the first time you have sat with one of these stories, then you might want to stick around. Because there are more. Each one is different. Each one is real in the ways that matter. Take care of the people who trust you. And the people who love you quietly, notice them. While you still can.